Stop. Take that out. There's no place here in this room with me, the un-American bullshit. Don't do that. The implication here, man, is that me, am un-American. I've been attacked just like the Russian hoax for being a Putin shill. I'm an American.
Well, when you talk about Ukraine's war with Russia, do you say we or do you say they?
I said we, the United States. We actually.
Well, you added the United States, but you had just described Israel strikes.
Israel didn't strike Fordo, Scott.
He talked about the U.S. attack on. You're speaking to this other people that you've heard that somehow they do say we, and they talk about, I would say, ridiculously, as if I've even heard some people basically put Israel above U.S. and they're American citizens. Yeah, that's fucking ridiculous. But none of those people are in this room.
In today's video, Scott Horton absolutely destroys Lex Fridman in a heated debate about Iran on the Lex Fridman podcast. What started as a discussion on Iran and the US recent strikes quickly turned personal when Scott Horton accused Lex Fridman of going soft on Israel. That's when Lex Fridman, normally calm and robot-like to be honest, finally snapped, raising his voice and showing real frustration on camera. This isn't your typical Lex Fridman interview. This is raw, unfiltered, and brutally honest. So let's dive in and watch how Scott Horton shuts down Lex Fridman in this heated debate on the Lex Fridman podcast.
And then what did Donald Trump say? Donald Trump, again, let him have the last word. And in fact, bragged and mocked and said, hey, thanks, Ayatollah, for giving us a warning that you were about to shoot missiles at our base so we could be ready to shoot them all down and this kind of thing. And he said, now is the time for peace. In other words, Trump again letting the Ayatollah get the last word. Why? Because the Ayatollah, he might be a horrible leader if you live in Iran, but he is not perfectly, but essentially cautious in foreign policy. Because what's he going to do? He's going to decimate our naval base at Bahrain. He's going to slaughter all our troops in Kuwait. And then what's Trump going to do? And so the Ayatollah knows. So it's the same people who, and I don't include him in this, but you hear a lot of the hawkish talk about just how easy this has been. These same people talking about what an absolutely irrational, religiously motivated and therefore, crazy and irrational group of people, the mullahs are, and why they can only be dealt with force. When in fact, what they're showing is essential conservatism, trying to hold on to what they got, making a latent deterrent because they know if they break out toward a bomb, that'll get them bombed. So they were hoping having a latent deterrent would be enough to just keep them at the status quo. That's why it's so disingenuous. Just again with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, saying, forget the intelligence because 60%, hey, it's 99% of the way there. Close enough for us. So it doesn't matter if the Ayatollahs decided to make or nuke or not. They're just too close to one as it is, which is really silly because they're not much closer than they've been for 20 years. Since the W. Bush administration, they proved they've mastered the fuel cycle.
That is one of the fundamental disagreements in the room, that you're saying they really don't have interest to develop a nuclear weapon, and they're not quite.
Well, not exactly. I mean, I said
more towards that direction than Mark is saying.
More toward, but they're saying, look at us. We're a threshold state. Don't push your luck, and force us to make the bad decision. Now that's an implication. They have not said that outright, but clearly the implication is that if we force them, then they will go ahead and make a nuclear weapon.
What I mean is, if left on their own devices, they would not develop. That's the case you're making.
Well, not just on their own devices, but if we were to try to negotiate with them in good faith and try to have normal relations with them, that would disincentivize a nuclear weapon even further.
You know, watching this, I've got to side with Scott Horton here because the broader historical record actually backs up what he's getting at. Iran's leadership, for all their domestic repression, has consistently acted with calculated self-preservation in foreign policy. People forget that back in 2003, right after the US invaded Iraq, Iran quietly sent a proposal to the Bush administration offering full negotiations on their nuclear program, recognition of Israel, and even cooperation in stabilizing Iraq. Bush tossed it aside. That's not the move of a government eager to start a war. That's a government trying to secure its position without blowing things up. And on the nuclear question, the US's own 2007 National Intelligence Estimate, representing all 16 American intelligence agencies, concluded that Iran halted any weapons program in 2003 and hadn't restarted it. Even the IAEA has repeatedly verified that Iran has not diverted nuclear material for weapons. It's not about trusting Tehran blindly, it's about recognizing the incentives in play. The cost of building and testing a bomb in full defiance of the world's most powerful military is astronomically high. The payoff? Pretty much zero, unless you're actively planning for Armageddon, which Iran clearly isn't. What frustrates me is that a lot of the hawks Lex seems to echo here ignores that deterrence is a two-way street. The US has surrounded Iran with military bases, sanctions, and surveillance for decades.
Okay, can you comment on the mission, on the
Yeah,
operation in
sure.
general?
A couple things I think were interesting what Scott said, and I agree with certainly with some of it. I mean, the first thing is I do believe President Trump has negotiated in good faith. I mean, he sent Steve Witkoff, his chief negotiator, for 5 rounds of negotiations since he came in office. The second is, I mean, we can keep going around in circles, but the fact of the matter is, I do believe that Iran and Iran-backed terrorist organizations have, since 1979, killed and tried to kill and maim Americans and taken them hostage. I think it's important for me again to put that on the record. But where I agree with Scott is, and it's interesting. I don't know if Khamenei has changed in his, he's 86 years old. He's been in power since 1989, and there's a little bit of history that I think is really interesting, Lex. It was 1988, and Iran and Iraq had fought this brutal 8-year war, 1 million people dead, and the United States accidentally shot down a Iranian passenger airline. The United States offered to pay compensation and apologized. And the Iranians didn't believe it. They didn't believe we could accidentally do that. They thought we were going to be intervening militarily on behalf of Saddam. So Khamenei, who's not the supreme leader at the time, he was the Iranian president, he and Rafsanjani, they go to Khomeini and they say, Mr. Ayatollah, we got to sue for peace with the Iraqis because the Americans are intervening, and we cannot fight the Americans. We fought this brutal war. We'll continue with Saddam. We cannot fight the United States of America. And I think Scott's right. Like, that perception that there's no way they can fight the United States of America, because that's regime ending, potentially. Even if we don't intend to, that could actually happen. And there's a famous line where Khomeini says, all right, I agree. I will drink the poison chalice. I'll drink the poison chalice, and I will agree to a ceasefire on pretty tough terms for Iran. It's interesting now, 36 years later, or 37 years later, Khamenei is now going to decide to drink the poison chalice. Does he agree to a negotiated deal with the United States? Does he agree to a deal that President Trump, and I mean, Scott criticizes me for it, but that's President Trump's position, is no enrichment, full dismantlement. By the way, that's backed up by 52 of 53 Republican senators and 177 House GOP members, and backed by everybody in his administration, including J.D. Vance, who's been emphatic about that. Does he agree to that deal, or does he decide, I'm not going to drink the poison chalice, and I'm going to take other options? Now, I agree with Scott. Like, going after U.S. military bases, except in a symbolic way, suicidal. Closing the Straits of Hormuz, 40% of Chinese oil goes through there. The Chinese have been saying to the Iranians, don't you dare. By the way, 100% of Iranian oil goes from Iran and Karg Island through the Straits of Hormuz, so economically suicidal for the Iranians to do that. Terror attacks, absolutely. I mean, that has been their modus operandi for years, so I would be concerned about terrorist attacks against U.S. targets, against civilians, potentially sleeper cells in the United States. So he's used terror cells around the world. He's engaged in a decades-long assassination campaign, including on American soil, by the way, sometimes successfully, sometimes not.
You know, listening to Lex Fridman and Mark here, it's pretty clear they're leaning into the same old script about Iran, one that conveniently leaves out some really important context. Yeah, Iran's government has done plenty of bad things, but framing them as uniquely bloodthirsty or irrational is just not backed up by the historical record. Since 1979, sure, they've been hostile to US interests, but that hostility didn't come out of nowhere. It came after decades of American intervention in Iran, starting with the CIA overthrowing their democratic government in 1953 and installing a brutal dictator. If you erase that part of the story, it's way too easy to paint everything since as unprovoked aggression. And this idea that Trump was negotiating in good faith? Come on, you don't call it good faith when you pull out the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that US intelligence confirmed Iran was following, then slap on maximum pressure sanctions designed to wreck their economy, and then demand they give up even more than before. That's not diplomacy at all. That's setting terms so impossible they're guaranteed to fail, just to justify keeping the pressure on. Even the Iran is a global terror mastermind line gets oversimplified. US intelligence has documented Iranian operations, sure, but if you step back, they're mostly asymmetric responses to being militarily outgunned and surrounded by US bases. The US and its allies have carried out assassinations, cyber attacks like Stuxnet, and military strikes inside Iran. Funny how those never get called terrorism when we do.
Including most recently where he went after an Iranian American 3 times to try to assassinate her in New York, a woman named Masih Alinejad. And so he's got to be calculating, like, what is my play? So if I don't do a deal, how can I actually squeeze the Americans? And Scott's right. Like, he must be thinking to himself, you know what? I was literally on the 99-yard line with an entire nuclear weapons capability. I should have crossed the goal line. If I had had a warhead, a nuclear warhead, or multiple nuclear warheads, as they had been trying to build since the Ahmad plan in early 2000s, there's no way Israel and the United States would have hit me militarily if I had nuclear weapons. Then I would have had the ultimate deterrence to prevent that. And then I would be like Kim Jong-un with nuclear weapons. I would then build ICBMs, and then I'd have the ultimate deterrent to stop that. So he's got to be thinking maybe now, and I can guarantee you, the Revolutionary Guards.
Do you think that might have anything to do with the fact that America attacked Iraq and Libya when they did not have weapons of mass destruction programs?
Can I tell you, the Libya example, I think, Scott, is the most interesting one for me, right? Because in the Libya example, it was a big mistake. By the way, Ukraine is another good example of this. We went to the Libyans and we said, you must fully dismantle your program. And Gaddafi said, reluctantly, under huge American pressure, okay, I'll do it. And the Brits and the Americans went in there and literally hauled out his entire nuclear.
It wasn't really a program. It was just a bunch of AQCON's junk sitting in crates in a warehouse. They did not have the capability to make a nuclear program at all in Libya. They didn't have the engineers, the scientists, or anyone. So Gaddafi had bought that junk just to trade it away. Just to be clear, there never was a nuclear weapons program or a nuclear program of any kind in Libya, unlike what you just heard.
But that wasn't my point. Okay, my point is he had a nuclear program.
Facts are important.
We can debate about, again, how we've been debating about whether, again, it's always Gaddafi and Khamenei and all these people. They don't really want nuclear weapons. We just misunderstand them. But that's not the point. The point is we did a deal with Gaddafi. We pulled out his nuclear program. And then, I don't know how many years later, but it wasn't too many years later, 7 years later, thank you, Scott, we actually took Gaddafi out. And he didn't have a nuclear program, so we took him out in the Libya operation. Now, Ukraine is another great example. The Ukrainians, after the fall of the Soviet Union, you know this, they had the Soviet nuclear arsenal or good parts of it on their soil. So we went to them and we said, all right, well, here's a deal for you. Give up the nuclear arsenal, right, off your territory, and we and the Russians and the French guarantee your territorial integrity and your sovereignty as a country. So the Ukrainians said, fair deal to me, gave up all the nuclear weapons, and then Putin has now invaded Ukraine twice.
That's not what the Bucharest Declaration says. that we promised their security. We promised to respect it, and the Russians promised to, and both sides broke that promise. But there's nothing like a
That's my
guarantee
point.
that America would protect Ukraine's sovereignty.
No,
if
no,
they
no.
gave up those nukes, and they had no ability to use those nukes anyway because they were Soviet nukes with Soviet codes. They belonged to the Soviet military, and the Ukrainians would have had no ability to use them or to deliver them. They were married to missiles that were made to fly around the world, not to Russia next door.
But Scott, my point is, and I think this you'll agree with this, my point is if you're Khamenei and you've seen those two examples of Libya, you gave up your nuclear program, Gaddafi gets taken down. Your Ukraine, you gave up your nuclear weapons, and the Russians invaded twice. If you're Khamenei thinking to yourself, the only thing that matters more to me than my nuclear weapons program is my regime's survival. And in 12 days of war, the Israelis specifically, because we hit Fordo and Isfahan and Natanz, we, the United States, hit those sites. We, the United States, hit those sites.
The gleeful nature, Scott, like, stop. Take that out. There's no place here in this room with me, the un-American bullshit. Don't do that. The implication here, man, is that me, am un-American. I've been attacked just like the Russian hoax for being a Putin shill. I'm an American.
Well, when you talk about Ukraine's war with Russia, do you say we or do you say they?
Honestly, listening to this back and forth, it's pretty clear why Scott's take makes more sense in the long run. If you actually look at the historical record, the Libya and Ukraine examples Mark keeps throwing around don't prove what they think they do. They actually reinforce Iran's paranoia about US and Western promises. Take Libya. The Bush administration publicly sold Gaddafi's 2003 disarmament as a foreign policy win, but behind closed doors, US and UK officials were already talking about regime change years before the Arab Spring. And when NATO finally intervened in 2011, the official line was humanitarian protection. But the operation quickly escalated into full-blown regime removal. From Tehran's perspective, that's not an incentive to give up capabilities. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when you have zero deterrent power. And Ukraine? The 1994 Budapest Memorandum wasn't a military defense pact. Diplomatic assurance, the US never promised armed intervention if Russia attacked. Plus, those Soviet-era nukes in Ukraine weren't even operated by Kyiv. They were tied to Russian launch codes. So painting that as they gave up working nukes and got invaded is misleading at best. If you were an Iranian strategist looking at that, you'd see it as proof that paper promises don't mean much when geopolitical interests shift. The reality is Iran's leadership plays the long game, push just far enough to maintain a deterrent threat, but stop short of actually building a weapon, because they know crossing that line would trigger the very war they're trying to avoid. Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing, and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out ground news in the description down below.